This video is intended solely for educational and documentary purposes and does not contain any ideological or political stance. Eastern Front 1944, a lone aircraft skims the treetops over a battlefield, engines snarling low. It's a gray-green Henschel Hs 129, a stocky twin-engined attacker slicing through the morning mist. Below, Soviet T-34 tanks churn forward. The German pilot grips the control stick tightly. He's practically encased in a steel bathtub of armor, peering through a narrow slit of bulletproof glass. He spots his prey, a column of tanks clanking amid the snow and mud. Lining up the lead tank in his gun sight, he braces as tracer fire streaks up to meet him. The Hs 129 dives fearlessly. Thud, thud, thud. Its 30mm nose cannon barks, each shot making the whole plane shudder. On the third burst, the T-34 erupts in flames, a direct hit. But triumph is fleeting. Flak shells explode around the Hs 129 and enemy machine guns riddle its wings. The pilot hauls back on the stick. This flying tank is tough, but it climbs like a stone. He skims out low, engine sputtering, limping back to base with barely a few meters between him and the treetops. It's another harrowing mission in a plane built to destroy tanks and to take punishment doing it. This was the life of an Hs 129 pilot. This was the Luftwaffe's most underrated warplane, the flying can opener of the Eastern Front. When we think of World War II German aircraft, iconic names like the Stuka dive bomber or the Messerschmitt Bf 109 come to mind. The Henschel Hs 129 is rarely mentioned. It didn't have the elegant lines of a fighter or the screaming sirens of a Stuka. It was small, stubby, and ugly to some, so much so that pilots nicknamed it the Duck. But looks were deceiving. The Hs 129 was a purpose-built tank killer, a heavily armored sledgehammer of a plane meant to crack open Allied armor from the air. In many ways, it was the A-10 Warthog of its day, designed around a massive gun, sacrificing speed and grace for firepower and survivability. It should have been a legend. Instead, it became a largely forgotten workhorse. Yet the story of the Hs 129 is one of ingenuity born from desperation, of bold innovation colliding with harsh reality. It's a chapter of World War II aviation that deserves to be heard, a chapter of promise, problems, and the brave pilots who flew a steel-encased beast straight into enemy fire. The tale of the Hs 129 begins years before those final desperate battles. In the late 1930s, German military planners realized they needed a new kind of warplane. The Spanish Civil War had taught them the value of close air support. The German Condor Legion's Ju-87 Stukas and even old Hs 123 biplanes had proven how effective airstrikes could be against ground targets. Now, with Europe on the path to war, the Luftwaffe wanted a dedicated Schlachtflugzeug, a ground attack aircraft, built specifically to shred tanks and troops on the battlefield. The existing Henschel Hs 123, a single-engine biplane, was outdated and too vulnerable. The new plane had to be tougher, deadlier. In 1937, the Air Ministry issued a specification for a heavily armored, small assault plane with twin engines for reliability. It was to carry multiple cannons and machine guns, maybe even bombs, and most importantly, it had to survive intense ground fire. In essence, they imagined a flying tank, a cockpit wrapped in armor with a front glass thick enough to stop bullets. 75mm thick glass, in fact. Like a windshield of solid steel, they wanted a plane that could fly low into the teeth of enemy fire and come out in one piece. Several companies answered the call. There were some truly wild designs on the drawing board. One proposal from Blohm & Voss was an asymmetrical aircraft, with the cockpit bizarrely mounted to the side of the engine nacelle. It looked like something out of a fever dream and was deemed far too unorthodox. Focke-Wulf submitted a more conventional design derived from their FW-189 reconnaissance plane, a sleek twin boomer, and Henschel an industrial firm known more for locomotives and heavy machinery, and later famous for building the Tiger tanks, offered its own prototype. Henschel's chief designer, Friedrich Nikolaus, came up with a stubby, compact monoplane with a triangular cross-section fuselage. It was basically built around an armored tub that encased the pilot. This steel tub formed the nose of the plane, with just a pair of small, angled glass blocks as a windshield. The cockpit was so cramped that the pilot's shoulders nearly touched the sides. The instrument panel had to be set low, almost on the pilot's lap, because the front armor left no space. In fact, some gauges were moved outside onto the inner walls of the engine nacelles, where the pilot could only see them by glancing sideways. Even the gun sight for aiming had to sit outside on top of the nose, just beyond the armored glass, because nothing could penetrate that protective cocoon. It was an unconventional design, but it met the key requirement. The pilot would be very well protected from ground fire coming head-on or below. This new Henschel plane, soon designated Hs-129, got the green light. It wasn't elegant or powerful, but it was smaller and cheaper than the Focke-Wulf proposal, which appealed to the cost-conscious Air Ministry. By spring 1939, the first prototype took flight. Almost immediately, problems appeared. The Hs-129 was underpowered, painfully so. The Air Ministry had insisted the design use low-power Argus as 410 engines, inverted V-12 engines that produced under 500 horsepower each, because they didn't want to divert more potent engines away from fighter production. The result was a twin-engine plane that, shockingly, had less total horsepower than a single Spitfire. With all that armor weight, the Hs-129 struggled in the sky. It could barely reach 400 kilometers per hour, around 250 miles per hour, at full throttle, slower than many single-engine planes. And as speed increased, the controls became heavy and unresponsive. The cockpit's tight layout forced the control stick to be very short, which gave the pilot little leverage. During test flights, pilots found that, in a dive, the aircraft was so hard to pull out that it felt like the controls had frozen. In fact, tragedy struck during one early test. In January 1940, an Hs-129 prototype went into a shallow dive, and the pilot could not pull up. The stick forces were too high. The stubby aircraft plowed straight into the ground. The test pilot never stood a chance. This incident sent a clear message. As it was, the Hs-129 was nearly unflyable at combat speeds. Luftwaffe evaluators were harshly critical. Some refused to accept the plane in its initial form. Visibility from the cockpit was atrocious too. The pilot could hardly see aside or behind, and even forward vision was through that mailbox slot of armored glass. Flying in formation was a nightmare. Getting two Hs-129s too close risked a mid-air collision simply because they couldn't see each other well. It was evident that serious changes were needed, or this flying tank concept would be stillborn. Henschel's engineers scrambled to improve the design. The solution to the power problem arrived from an ironic source: captured French engines. When Germany defeated France in 1940, they gained access to stocks of the Nomron 14M, a 14-cylinder radial engine built in France. These radials churned out around 700 horsepower each, a welcome boost over the feeble Argus engines. By early 1941, Henschel had fitted the Hs-129 with the French engines, and the improvement was immediate. The new Hs-129B series had enough power to carry its weapons and armor without being a total slug. It was still no racehorse, but at least it could stay aloft with a full load of guns, ammo, and bombs. The Luftwaffe pilots who re-evaluated it noted the better, if still not stellar, handling. The heavy stick forces were reduced a bit, though not eliminated. Visibility was still poor and always would be. The armor that kept you safe also kept you blind. But despite its flaws, this armored duck of an aircraft was now ready for war. In April 1942, the Hs-129 officially entered service in frontline squadrons. The timing was critical. By 1942, on the Eastern Front, German forces were encountering swarms of Soviet tanks, far more than they ever expected. In 1941's Operation Barbarossa, the Germans had been shocked to find that the Red Army fielded not 10,000 tanks, as their intelligence had estimated, but over 20,000. And newer, tougher models were arriving, like the T-34 with its thick, sloped armor and the KV heavy tanks. The German army needed every tool available to stem this armored tide. Enter the Hs 129. Here, at last, was a purpose-built tank buster to supplement the aging Stukas in the close support role. The Hs 129's debut in combat came in the late spring of 1942, supporting German operations in the Crimea. Flying low over the Black Sea steppe, H-129 pilots swooped in against Soviet tank columns and artillery positions. Their standard armament at that time was modest by later standards: 2 20mm cannon and 2 rifle-caliber machine guns in the nose, plus small bombs under the belly. This could shred trucks, gun emplacements, and light tanks, but struggled against a robust T-34 unless they hit it from a favorable angle. Still, early reports were cautiously optimistic. The Hs 129 proved effective in delivering pinpoint strikes. Its stable gun platform, thanks to its weight and twin-engine balance, allowed accurate shooting on the move, and crucially, it could absorb ground fire that would rip other planes apart. Pilots returned to base with their planes peppered full of bullet holes, but alive. The armor plate and that thick windshield did their job. Shrapnel and machine gun rounds simply bounced off the Hs 129's nose like pebbles off a tortoise shell. For the first time, the Germans had an aircraft that could dive into low-level anti-tank attacks with a reasonable hope of surviving the gauntlet of Soviet flak and machine guns. Flush with this initial success, the Luftwaffe began deploying Hs 129 units wherever the ground fighting was fiercest. A few even went to North Africa in late 1942, as Rommel's Africa Corps desperately tried to hold off Allied armor in Tunisia. In the desert, the Hs 129 faced new challenges. The fine sand wreaked havoc on those radial engines, choking them and causing frequent failures. The crews fitted special filters, but it only partially helped. Allied air superiority was growing too. Slow, low-flying Hs 129s were easy prey for roaming British Spitfires and American P-40s once spotted. By May 1943, when the last Axis forces in Africa surrendered, the handful of Hs 129s sent there were either destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel and spare parts. The experiment in the desert had been harsh. The Hs 129 could be potent against tanks, but only if it had the right conditions: command of the air, or at least no enemy fighters around, and reasonable logistics. Back in the Soviet Union, the Hs 129 found a more natural home. There, in the wide battlefields of the Eastern Front, it could fly treetop-level attack runs against Soviet armored spearheads. As 1943 dawned, the Eastern Front saw titanic clashes of armor, and the Hs 129 squadrons were thrown into the fray. In July 1943, the Battle of Kursk unleashed the largest tank battle in history. Hundreds upon hundreds of Soviet and German tanks dueled across the plains. The Luftwaffe sent waves of ground attack planes to support their troops. H-129s joined the action, stalking Russian tanks from above. On paper, this should have been the Hs 129's moment to shine, a target-rich environment of enemy armor, and indeed they claimed some successes. German reports from those battles speak of dozens of Soviet tanks knocked out by air attack. But the cold truth was that the Hs 129s were too few in number to change the battle's outcome. There were maybe a few dozen operational Hs 129s at Kursk versus thousands of Soviet tanks. On one critical day of the offensive, German ground attack aircraft flew over 1,000 sorties. Of those, only a small fraction, perhaps 50 or so, were by Hs 129s. Even when they destroyed a tank here and there, it was a drop in the bucket compared to the Red Army's reserves, and the environment was unforgiving. Dense flak batteries surrounded Soviet tank formations, and swarms of Soviet fighters prowled above. The Hs-129 pilots had to fly through a lethal wall of fire on every mission. Losses mounted. For every tank they blasted, an Hs-129 might be shot down by a lucky flak burst or caught by a Yak or Lavochkin fighter during its ingress or egress. It was a war of attrition that this aircraft, for all its toughness, could not escape. Yet, despite all the dangers and limitations, the Hs-129 earned the respect of its crews. They appreciated its ruggedness. Many pilots remarked that the Hs-129 could absorb hits that would down other planes and still bring them home. Some came to affectionately call it the flying can opener for the way it could pry open Soviet tank armor, or the Panzerknacker, tank cracker. And as clunky as it was, in the hands of a skilled pilot, it could be deadly. One such pilot was Hauptmann Rudolf Heinz Ruffer. Ruffer was an attack pilot who truly mastered the Hs-129's deadly potential. Through 1943 and 1944, he flew the stubby aircraft in countless anti-tank missions. Ruffer became one of the deadliest tank-busting aces of the war. He was officially credited with destroying 80 enemy tanks. Imagine that, 80 tanks knocked out from the air, each one a small victory amid the endless waves of Soviet armor. In June 1944, Ruffer's extraordinary success earned him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest awards for valor. But his story also highlights the peril that stalked every Hs-129 pilot. Just a month after receiving his medal, in July 1944, Ruffer's plane was hit by Soviet anti-aircraft fire while he was attacking yet another armored column near Lviv. The flak shell detonated, and his Hs-129 exploded in midair, killing him instantly. He was only 24. Ruffer's fate was sadly common among his peers. Few Hs-129 pilots survived the war. They flew low and slow into the teeth of enemy defenses, a job that often proved fatal. Their bravery was immense. It took nerves of steel to dive onto a battlefield where every gun below was aimed right at you. These men believed in their unique aircraft, flaws and all, and squeezed every ounce of performance out of it to support the troops on the ground. As the war ground on, the German command sought even greater firepower from the Hs-129. The standard 20mm guns were effective against soft targets, but marginal against newer Soviet tanks. So engineers experimented with upgunning the plane. They hung a 30mm Mk-101 cannon in a belly pod, a single-shot hard-hitting gun that could punch through about 25mm of armor at a good angle. With tungsten-cored ammo, that meant if an Hs-129 pilot could dive on the thinner top armor of a T-34 or aim at its engine deck, he had a fair chance of brewing it up. This upgrade proved useful, and many Hs-129s carried the 30mm cannon pod, especially the B-2 models. But even that wasn't enough when Soviet heavy tanks like the formidable IS-2 appeared. Thus came the most audacious version of the Hs-129, the B-3 variant, essentially a flying artillery piece. It was fitted with a 7.5-centimeter Bordkanone, 75mm anti-tank cannon, the same caliber as the standard German Pak-40 field gun. This was one of the largest guns ever successfully fired from an aircraft at the time. To mount it, Henschel engineers took a modified Pak-40 gun with a hydraulic recoil dampener and an auto-loader and slung it in a huge pod under the fuselage. The barrel jutted well past the plane's nose, looking like a giant spear. The setup held 12 rounds in a magazine, which could reload automatically. The pilot just had to line up a tank in his sight, press a button, and boom! The recoil was so massive that in testing, each shot jolted the plane violently. Pilots joked that firing the 75mm felt like getting hit by a train from underneath. In fact, if the Hs-129 wasn't almost perfectly straight and level, the force of firing could send it tumbling. A burst from the 75mm would often cause the aircraft to dip or even momentarily stall. Needless to say, it took a very steady hand and perhaps a dose of insanity to aim this monster in combat. The B-3, with its flying howitzer, could, in theory, kill any tank in the world with a single hit. Even the thickest armor would yield to a 75mm shell slamming down from above. A handful of these super cannon Hs 129s were deployed in mid to late 1944. There are accounts that they managed to destroy a few heavy Soviet tanks that had been nearly impervious to other air attacks. Just the sight and sound of that 75mm gun was terrifying, both to the enemy and to the Hs 129's own crews. But this ultimate tank buster came far too late and in too few numbers to change the tide. Only about 25 of the 75mm armed Hs 129s were built, and they proved cumbersome and difficult to use. The added weight made the already sluggish Hs 129 even slower and harder to handle. In combat, they were often more vulnerable due to the weight and recoil issues, and most were lost or grounded before they could make any significant mark. By the autumn of 1944, the writing was on the wall for Germany. Fuel was scarce, Allied fighters roamed at will, and on the Eastern Front, the Soviets had achieved air superiority in many sectors. Hs 129 units continued to fight ferociously, moving from one embattled sector to another, trying to blunt Soviet armored thrusts. They saw action in the defense of Romania and Poland as the Red Army advanced. In a twist of fate, the nation of Romania, which had been Germany's ally and operated a squadron of Hs 129s themselves, switched sides in August 1944 to join the Allies. For a brief period, Romanian pilots actually flew the Hs 129 against German forces in the chaotic battles that followed. One of the only times in history a Nazi Germany warplane was used by a former ally to attack German troops. It was an ironic postscript to the Hs 129's career, built to protect Axis troops from Soviet tanks, and ending up turned against the Nazis in the end. As 1945 arrived, only a handful of Hs 129s were still operational. Production had ceased in late 1944, with around 865 aircraft built in total from start to finish, a small number compared to, say, the 36,000 Il-2 Sturmovik attack planes built by the Soviets. The few Hs 129s left were fighting an impossible battle, flying in a dark sky swarming with enemy fighters and flak, trying to slow an avalanche of Soviet armor rolling towards Berlin. In those final months, many of the remaining Hs 129s succumbed to mechanical breakdowns. There were no spare parts or fuel to keep them going. Ground crews cannibalized whatever they could to patch a few together. Some planes were simply destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture or abandoned on remote airfields as the units retreated. By war's end in May 1945, the Henschel Hs 129 had effectively vanished from the skies. In the aftermath of World War II, unlike the Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs, the Hs 129 did not earn a prominent place in history books. It was a plane that arrived too late, in too small numbers, and under too dire conditions to truly show what it might have achieved. Allied forces did examine a few captured Hs 129s. One or two were shipped to the United States for testing, but none were preserved in museums. Over time, every last Hs 129 airframe was scrapped or lost to the elements. Today, not a single complete Hs 129 survives. Only photographs, a few relics, and stories like those of Rudolf Heinz Ruffer remain to attest to its existence. It truly became a forgotten warrior. Yet, in retrospect, the Hs 129 has earned a measure of respect among historians and aviation enthusiasts. It was, after all, the world's first mass-produced dedicated anti-tank aircraft. In concept, it was ahead of its time. The idea of a flying gun with heavy armor protecting the pilot would reappear decades later in modern planes like the American A-10 Thunderbolt II. The Hs 129 story is a fascinating study in trade-offs: armor versus agility, firepower versus flight performance. It demonstrated how difficult it was to build an aircraft that could survive in the hellish low-altitude environment of modern mechanized warfare. It also highlighted the bravery of those who flew in such environments. The plane itself was underrated, often dismissed as a footnote, but it gave the German army a tool it desperately needed, even if only in limited capacity. Pilots like Ruffer showed that, with skill and courage, the Hs 129 could exact a heavy price on the enemy. In the final tally, the Henschel Hs 129 did not win the war for Germany. It couldn't. By the time it was fully fielded, Germany was already on the strategic defensive, overwhelmed by the sheer industrial might of the Allies and the Red Army's numbers. But the Hs 129 fought hard in its niche. It saved the lives of countless German soldiers by knocking out enemy tanks that would have otherwise overrun positions. It gave tank crews on the other side nightmares, knowing that somewhere above, beyond the clouds of flak, a silent hunter might be diving at them with cannons blazing. And for the men who flew it, it was a dependable, if unglamorous comrade, a tough metal guardian that often brought them back home against the odds. In that sense, the Hs 129 earned its place as a remarkable aircraft of World War II, not for dazzling air combat or record-breaking feats, but for embodying the gritty, unyielding struggle on the Eastern Front. It was truly a flying tank in spirit, relentless, resilient, and unbowed until it could fight no more. The Henschel Hs 129 may be the most underrated aircraft of World War II. It wasn't a superstar of the Luftwaffe, but it was a steadfast warrior built for a task no other aircraft at the time could do quite as well, ripping open the armored heart of the enemy on the ground. In its short, ferocious career, it left a legacy of innovation under fire and courage against all odds. This video is presented for educational and documentary purposes, a tribute to history, with no ideology or propaganda. Let the story of the Hs 129 stand as a testament to the ingenuity and bravery found even in the darkest chapters of war.